It starts so softly, you could almost miss it. A message receives no reply. A voice that once filled his days suddenly disappears. At first, he notices the change. The way someone notices an empty space on a wall where something familiar used to hang. Something feels different, but life keeps moving. Then days stretch into weeks, and little by little, her absence stops feeling like a simple break in the pattern. It becomes a presence of its own. Dense, lingering, almost breathing in the room with him. Most people assume that when a man misses a woman, he is simply missing her. Her laugh, the way she moved through ordinary moments, the small expressions she used without even thinking. But psychology, especially through the lens of Carl Jung, points to something much more unsettling. When she disappears, he does not only miss her. His mind begins to recreate her. Jung's understanding of attachment was deeply revealing. He recognized that when someone important leaves our world, memory does not preserve them with perfect accuracy. It reshapes them. Like an artist restoring a portrait, but slowly altering the original without realizing it. When she is gone, his mind no longer holds only the real woman. It holds a version of her. A version sharpened, heightened, revised. A ghost wearing her image. Think of it this way. In the beginning, his memory still carries the ordinary friction. The moments when she was frustrated, when she misunderstood him, when tension existed between them. But as time passes, those rough places begin to fade. Not because she was flawless, but because the mind often erases discomfort to shield itself from deeper suffering. The brain edits emotion like a hidden craftsman. It softens the difficult parts, blurs the arguments, removes the complexity of who she really was. And what remains? A fantasy. A figure of extraordinary warmth and impossible understanding. A version of her that was never entirely real. Jung himself did not use the term thema collapse. That language came later through modern attachment theory. But the idea fits here with striking precision. A thema is the central emotional storyline that organizes a person's inner life. And for many men, whether they recognize it or not, that inner story is profoundly shaped by the women who have marked them most deeply. And here's the brutal truth. Men are often trained from boyhood to outsource emotional labor to women. From mothers to girlfriends to wives, they rely on women not only to listen, but to translate their own feelings for them. When she's there, she acts as an emotional mirror. When he's sad, she names it. When he's anxious, she calms it. When he's insecure, she reassures him. So when she vanishes, he doesn't just lose her. He loses access to himself. Without realizing it, she was carrying his inner world for him. Now that weight comes crashing back into his own hands, and he doesn't know how to hold it. The first stage, disorientation. In the early days after she disappears, his world is loud with unanswered questions. Where is she? Why did she leave? What is she doing now? He tells himself he just needs closure. Just one more conversation, just one explanation. But this is an illusion. What he really craves is the restoration of his emotional anchor. Not answers, balance. Jung believed that the psyche hates a vacuum. When something essential is taken away, the mind rushes to fill the gap. Even if it has to invent something. That's why he starts replaying old moments over and over. Each time editing them slightly, smoothing over the awkwardness, polishing her into a flawless gem. The second stage, the birth of the ghost. This is where obsession begins. Not with the living woman, but with the version he's built in his mind. Imagine a film editor cutting together every beautiful frame, deleting every argument, every moment of distance. Now, imagine playing that film on a loop every night before bed. That's what's happening in his head. Jung called this projection. It's when you take parts of your own psyche, hopes, ideals, unfulfilled desires, and project them onto someone else, often someone absent. The projection doesn't reflect reality. It reflects you. In other words, he's not in love with her anymore. He's in love with the story he tells himself about her. Why the ghost is more powerful than reality. Here's the paradox. The real woman, the one who laughed, argued, got tired, had flaws, could never compete with the ghost in his mind. Reality is always messier than fantasy. But when reality disappears, fantasy becomes the only version available. And fantasy has no limits. It doesn't age. It doesn't disappoint. It doesn't contradict him. So his longing intensifies, not because she's returned, but because the ghost has grown more perfect. And perfection is addictive. The psychological hook. Why does this process hook him so deeply? Because losing her didn't just remove a person from his life. It removed the scaffolding that held up his sense of self. He's not just chasing her. He's chasing the version of himself that existed when she was there. This is why so many men will chase an ex harder after the breakup than they ever pursued her while together. It's not about her. It's about the identity he lost. The man he thinks he was when she was by his side. The unspoken male vulnerability. Society rarely allows men to admit this. We tell men to be self-reliant, to man up, to never let emotions control them. But quietly, invisibly, they often tether their emotional stability to the women they love. When that tether is cut, the fall is brutal. And because they can't say, "I've lost myself," they say, "I've lost her." It's easier to mourn a person than to admit you've been hollow without realizing it. The moment a woman disappears, the man's mind begins a strange, almost magical process. But it's not magic. It's psychology. The reality he lost is replaced by a mental construct far more dangerous than memory itself. The fantasy spiral. At first, it seems harmless. He remembers her smile, the way she tilted her head when she laughed, the sound of her voice in the middle of the night. Small moments replay like cherished film clips. But then the mind begins to edit. And with editing comes distortion. Imagine sitting at an old film reel. Each scene is a memory. But the editor, your mind, is biased. It doesn't aim for truth. It aims for comfort. He deletes the uncomfortable frames, arguments, moments of disappointment, times when she irritated him. He enhances the beautiful frames, the way her hair caught the sunlight, the softness of her touch, the way she made him feel alive. And then, he starts filling in the gaps with fantasy. Did she really say that line? Maybe not. Did she look that flawless? Probably not. But his mind doesn't care. The ghost must be perfect. This is the fantasy spiral. It doesn't just preserve memory, it amplifies and idealizes it, creating an impossible version of her that never existed. Projection. Falling in love with a ghost. Carl Jung called this process projection. Projection happens when we take our inner desires, fears, and ideals and attach them to someone else. Normally, it's subtle, small hopes, fleeting assumptions. But when a person disappears, projection can consume the psyche. He's no longer in love with a woman herself. He's in love with what she represents. She becomes the symbol of everything he longs for. Warmth, understanding, validation. Every flaw she had in reality is erased. Every quality he admired is magnified. She turns into the mirror reflecting the perfect version of himself, the self he wanted to be when she was there. And here's the cruel twist. The more he chases the ghost, the more detached he becomes from reality. Why fantasy feels safer than reality. You might wonder, if obsession grows, why doesn't he confront reality? Because reality is unpredictable. Reality includes flaws, contradictions, moments of discomfort. Reality could reject him, disappoint him, or remind him of the void she left behind. Fantasy is safe. It always loves him. It always validates him. It never disappears because it's entirely in his control. The spiral tightens. The more he indulges it, the less he can distinguish between the real woman and the ghost. And soon, the ghost becomes more real than reality itself. The spiral psychological mechanics. The fantasy spiral has three main forces feeding it. 1. Memory editing. The mind actively rewrites past events to suit the narrative of loss and perfection. 2. Idealization. Every positive memory is amplified until it becomes exaggerated, almost mythical. 3. Emotional anchoring. He anchors himself to the ghost to avoid confronting his own emptiness, pain, or regret. Each of these forces accelerates the spiral, creating an emotional vortex that can consume months, years, even decades of his life. The emotional addiction. At this stage, the mind is no longer just remembering. It is addicted. Every day, he returns to the ghost for comfort. Every night, he fantasizes about conversations, moments that never happened, reunions that will never occur. Why does this feel addictive? Because the brain rewards longing and nostalgia with dopamine. Every mental reunion, every imagined encounter, releases a chemical reward that feels almost like love, but it's synthetic. It's a chemical echo of desire, not the real experience. This is why many men chase ex-partners harder than they ever pursued them in real life. They are not chasing her. They are chasing the chemical thrill of the idealized ghost. The spiral's dangerous side. The danger of the fantasy spiral is subtle but devastating. 1. Distorted judgment. He begins to compare every new woman to the ghost, finding them inferior even if reality is better. 2. Emotional isolation. As he sinks deeper, he talks less, shares less, and isolates himself to protect the fantasy. 3. Self-obfuscation. He stops seeing his own flaws because the ghost absorbs all attention. His own emotional growth is stalled. Eventually, the ghost is no longer a memory. It becomes the lens through which he views life, warping every relationship, every interaction, every decision. The spiral and the void. Why does he fall so deeply into this spiral? Because the woman's disappearance is not just about losing her. It's about losing the structure that held up his inner world. The absence creates a void, and humans hate voids. The spiral is a psychological strategy to avoid confronting emptiness. He doesn't ask, "Why am I so lost without her?" Instead, he asks, "How can I bring her back?" Or bring back what she represented. In other words, he chases a ghost to avoid facing himself. How the spiral manifests in behavior. You can see it in subtle ways. Constantly scrolling through old messages, photos, social media. Replaying conversations in his mind, rewriting them over and over. Romanticizing mutual friends' stories about her life. Imagining her with perfect responses, perfect gestures, perfect affection. Every action is a mental rehearsal of the ghost, a practice in loving what isn't real. And the more he indulges, the more real the ghost feels, creating a self-reinforcing loop. The spiral feeds itself. The brutal truth. At this stage, the fantasy spiral reveals a harsh reality. He is not in love with her. He is in love with a story, a memory, and a projection. The real woman is irrelevant. Her disappearance has triggered a psychological labyrinth he must navigate alone. And here's what most men don't admit, even to themselves. The obsession is less about losing her. It's about losing access to the self that existed when she was there. The spiral is a protective mechanism against confronting inner emptiness, vulnerability, and unfulfilled desire. The fantasy spiral is intoxicating. It comforts, protects, and seduces. But eventually, every spiral reaches a boundary. A man who has been chasing ghosts will eventually confront the shadow, the parts of himself he has long avoided. Carl Jung called it the shadow, the hidden, denied, and often uncomfortable aspects of the psyche. For men obsessed with a lost woman, the shadow doesn't just exist. It demands confrontation. The moment of collapse. The shadow war begins subtly. It starts when the fantasies failed to satisfy. The ghost that once offered comfort now seems distant, fragile, and unresponsive. He may realize no matter how vividly he imagines her, she does not answer. No matter how perfect he recalls her, she cannot return. No matter how much he idealizes, the hole inside him remains. This is the first stage of the shadow. Confrontation. Collapse of the fantasy as a defense mechanism. The collapse is brutal. Men often try to escape it through distraction, work, new relationships, alcohol, or constant social engagement. But the shadow is persistent. It whispers questions he cannot avoid. Who am I without her? Why do I feel so hollow? Was I ever really present? Or was I living in a story I created? The shadow is mirror. Here's the terrifying truth. The shadow is not an external enemy. It is a mirror. Every trace of obsession, every fantasy, every longing is reflected back, asking the man to face his own emptiness. When a woman disappears, she does not just take herself away. She removes the scaffolding that supports his emotional identity. The fantasy spiral had masked the void. But now the shadow says, "This is who you are when no one else carries your emotions." This confrontation is deeply uncomfortable because it exposes what he has long avoided: reliance on external validation. The shadow war begins. The war is waged internally in three primary battlegrounds. 1. Emotion. Every wave of longing, jealousy, or regret becomes a battlefield. Each feeling challenges him to sit with discomfort instead of fleeing into fantasy. 2. Memory. The mind begins to question the edited recollections. The ghost begins to fracture, showing glimpses of reality, arguments, flaws, disappointment. 3. Identity. He begins to question who he is beyond her presence. The part of him that relied on her reflection feels naked, small, uncertain. This is a psychological war without bullets or swords, but its wounds are no less real. Sleepless nights, obsessive thoughts, and emotional instability become the front lines. Facing the void. The shadow war forces him to confront the void within himself. No one is carrying his emotions now. No one is naming his fears or soothing his insecurities. He is finally alone with the unprocessed parts of his psyche. Many men panic at this point, doubling down on obsession or fleeing into denial. But the shadow offers an alternative, Confrontation. Facing the void is painful, but it is also transformative. It is the point where a man can either continue to chase ghosts or begin to reclaim himself. The ghost versus the shadow. At this stage, the battle becomes clear. The ghost, perfect, alluring, and comforting, but unreal. The shadow, uncomfortable, imperfect, demanding attention, but real. The man must choose which to serve. The ghost seduces with nostalgia, emotional reward, and fantasy. The shadow confronts with emptiness, fear, and truth. Most men linger in a state of conflict. They oscillate between fantasy and reality, unable to commit to the harder path. Integration of the shadow, the role of obsession in the shadow war. Obsession, Jung might argue, is a protective mechanism. It allows a man to avoid facing the shadow by fixating on the ghost, idealizing what is gone, distracting himself from uncomfortable truths about dependency, fear, or inadequacy. But obsession is finite. Sooner or later, the mind demands authenticity. The fantasy spiral can no longer sustain itself indefinitely. This is why the shadow war feels like suffering. It is the mind's demand for growth. Why men resist the shadow? Men resist because confronting the shadow is painful and isolating. It requires admitting reliance on others for emotional stability. It requires acknowledging unmet desires and internal limitations. It requires stepping into discomfort without the comfort of fantasy. This is why men often cling to memory, nostalgia, or imagined reunions. The ghost is familiar. The shadow is unknown. But the longer he resists, the more the shadow fights back, manifesting as uncontrolled anger, anxiety and restlessness, emotional numbness, self-sabotage in relationships or career, the opportunity hidden in suffering. Yet the shadow also brings a rare opportunity. By facing the emptiness, he can reclaim autonomy over his emotions. By confronting the illusions he created, he can discern reality from fantasy. By integrating the shadow, he can mature into a man who does not need others to carry his inner world. Jung believed that the shadow war, though brutal, is a necessary stage for individuation, the process of becoming a complete, self-aware person. The shadow war is relentless. The fantasy spiral has collapsed, leaving him face to face with his own emptiness. Now comes the critical stage, reconciliation or ruin. This is the moment when a man's psyche makes a choice, either to integrate the lessons of loss and obsession or to spiral deeper into self-destruction. The fork in the path. At this juncture, two paths emerge. 1. Reconciliation. Accepting reality, confronting the shadow, and reclaiming autonomy over his inner world. 2. Ruin. Doubling down on obsession, denying reality, and letting the ghost or fantasy control his life. The difference between these paths is subtle, but life-altering. Reconciliation demands courage, honesty, and self-awareness. Ruin demands nothing but stubborn avoidance, the trap of nostalgia. Many men cling to nostalgia as a false lifeline. They replay old memories endlessly. They contact her indirectly through social media, mutual friends, or imagined scenarios. They build elaborate mental fantasies of reconciliation, what could have been, or perfect endings. This is not love. It's emotional procrastination. Nostalgia feels safe, but it is a trap. It prevents the man from engaging with reality, from rebuilding himself, and from forming genuine connections. The real work of reconciliation. Reconciliation begins with acceptance of reality. She is gone. The relationship ended. The story he told himself about her was partially constructed by his own desires. Acceptance is not resignation. It is clarity. It is the acknowledgement that life continues even without the presence of the person he idealized. From here, real transformation can occur. 1. Acknowledging dependency, recognizing the ways he relied on her for emotional regulation. 2. Facing loneliness, sitting with the void instead of filling it with fantasy. 3. Redefining identity, understanding that his worth, value, and happiness are not dependent on her. This is hard, often excruciating work, but it is the only path out of the spiral, the subtle danger of partial reconciliation. Some men attempt half measures. They reduce obsession, but keep remnants of fantasy alive. They convince themselves they aren't obsessed while secretly replaying memories. They avoid real intimacy because they remain emotionally tethered to the ghost. Partial reconciliation is dangerous. It creates a schizophrenic mind, split between reality and illusion, which continues to sabotage relationships, career, and emotional health. True reconciliation demands full confrontation with the shadow in the fantasy spiral. The role of shadow integration. Integration of the shadow is central to reconciliation. The shadow contains unacknowledged desires, fears, and vulnerabilities. By facing it, a man learns to self-soothe, self-reflect, and stand alone emotionally. Integration allows him to differentiate between real love and fantasy, desire and projection, attachment and obsession. Without this, the ghost will always hold power, no matter how much time passes. Ruin, the alternative path. Not every man chooses reconciliation. Some remain trapped in ruin. Signs of ruin include persistent obsession with the ghost long after the relationship ended, idealization of memories to the point of denying reality, sabotage of new relationships because no one compares, chronic emotional instability, depression, or anxiety. Ruin is not immediate. It creeps in slowly, feeding on nostalgia, fantasy, and avoidance. It transforms longing into a perpetual state of suffering. The psychological mechanics of ruin. Ruin is driven by the same mechanisms that fueled the fantasy spiral. 1. Projection. Continuing to attach unmet desires to a person who no longer exists. 2. Addiction to emotional reward. Seeking dopamine from nostalgic memory rather than real interaction. 3. Avoidance of self-confrontation. Fleeing from the shadow through distraction, denial, or obsession. The longer a man indulges in these patterns, the harder it becomes to break free. Every reinforcement strengthens the neural pathways of obsession, signs of emerging reconciliation. Despite the challenges, reconciliation is possible, and there are signs that a man is on the right path. He notices the ghost without immediately giving it power over his emotions. He can enjoy memories without being consumed by them. He confronts loneliness without panic, using it as an opportunity for reflection. He begins investing in himself, his goals, passions, and personal growth independent of external validation. These are subtle shifts, often invisible to others, but they signal the beginning of liberation from obsession. Reconciliation as mastery of self. Ultimately, reconciliation is less about the woman and more about mastery of the self. He learns to carry his own emotions. He develops a self-contained sense of worth. He no longer needs others to maintain his psychic equilibrium. This is the paradox. The man who loses a woman can emerge stronger than before, not because he retains her, but because he reclaims himself. The role of time. Time is not a cure, but a partner in reconciliation. Obsession diminishes not merely with the passage of days, but with active psychological work. Healing requires reflection, confrontation with the shadow, and letting go of fantasy. Time allows the man to reconstruct his internal world without reliance on the ghost. Reconciliation is a process, not a moment. It unfolds over months or years, requiring patience, self-compassion, and persistence. The disappearance sparked the void. The void birthed the ghost. The ghost fed the spiral. The spiral collapsed into the shadow war. The war brought him to a choice: reconciliation or ruin. Now comes the final stage: transformation. This is where the man who once clung to a phantom learns to master attachment. Not by avoiding love, but by loving without chains. From dependency to autonomy. Attachment mastery begins with a profound shift in orientation. He no longer relies on someone else to carry his emotional life. For years, perhaps decades, he may have been outsourcing his self-worth to her approval, outsourcing his calm to her presence, outsourcing his joy to her affection. Now he takes that responsibility back. This is not a rejection of intimacy. It's the opposite. Autonomy allows intimacy to flourish because it is no longer rooted in fear of loss. The death of the ghost. The first sign of transformation is when the ghost loses its grip. He can recall her without longing, turning into obsession. He can remember flaws without feeling betrayed. He can let her image fade without panic. The ghost no longer defines his reality because he no longer needs it as an emotional anchor. Instead of worshiping the fantasy, he honors the reality, good and bad, without letting it dictate his self-concept. Reframing the loss. In transformation, the story changes. The disappearance is no longer seen as a theft, but as a catalyst. Without the loss, he would have never faced his shadow, confronted his dependency, or reclaimed his emotional sovereignty. He reframes the narrative from "she left and I lost everything" to "she left and I found myself." This reframing is not self-deception. It's a genuine shift in perspective, born from the integration of pain and growth. Emotional self-reliance. Attachment mastery is not about being emotionless. It's about being self-reliant in emotions. He learns to recognize his own feelings without needing someone else to label them. Soothe his own anxiety without demanding external reassurance. Validate his own worth without constant external feedback. The man who masters his own emotions is no longer a hostage to the presence or absence of another person. The capacity for real love. Here's the paradox. The less he clings, the more he can love. Without projection, he can see a partner clearly, without needing her to complete him. Without dependency, he can give freely without fear that giving will deplete him. Without the ghost, he can accept imperfection without it threatening his sense of self. Real love requires two whole people, not two halves trying to merge into a fragile unity. The tools of attachment mastery. The transformation process is not accidental. It can be built intentionally with these tools. 1. Radical self-honesty. Owning the ways he projected, avoided, or depended. 2. Shadow integration. Accepting the parts of himself that are insecure, needy, or fearful. 3. Boundaries. Establishing emotional limits without building walls. 4. Mindful memory. Remembering the past without letting it distort the present. 5. Purpose beyond romance. Anchoring identity and values. passions and goals outside of relationships. These tools keep him from falling back into the spiral if another relationship ends. Signs of transformation. When attachment mastery has been achieved, it shows in subtle but unmistakable ways. Emotional steadiness. Breakups hurt, but they no longer unravel him. Present-focused love. He invests in what is, not what was or what could be. Non-possessiveness. He doesn't see a partner as something to own, but as someone to walk beside. Authentic connection. He connects without masks, without desperate attempts to be enough. The man who once chased a ghost can now embrace a living, imperfect human being and be embraced in return. The psychological completion of the journey. Carl Jung would call this the completion of an individuation cycle. The journey from unconscious dependency to conscious selfhood. The disappearance was the spark. The ghost became the distraction. The shadow became the trial. The reconciliation became the pivot, and the transformation became the reward. He is no longer shaped by who remained and who walked away. He is shaped by the way he holds himself, no matter who enters or exits his life. Living beyond the fear of loss. Attachment mastery means existing without the constant terror of losing love. Not because he no longer feels pain, but because loss no longer shakes the foundation of who he is. When love is no longer ruled by fear, it turns into a choice rather than a compulsion. It becomes a daily expression of generosity, not a frantic act of emotional survival. And this is the highest form of attachment. Secure, grounded, and self-sustaining. Passing the lesson forward. Men who reach this stage often begin guiding others. Friends, brothers, even strangers still trapped in their own cycles. They recognize the symptoms, the obsession, the worship of the ghost, the refusal to face the shadow. And they speak with weight because they have lived through it themselves. That becomes another level of transformation, turning private pain into shared wisdom. In the end, the woman's disappearance was never only about her. It was the mirror that exposed everything he had avoided within himself. It was the force that pushed him to become a man capable of holding his own heart. It was the lesson that love without freedom is not love at all. It is dependency. He no longer needs the ghost. He no longer runs from the shadow. He can love, lose, and love again without losing himself in the process. This is more than healing. This is rebirth. Epilogue. Attachment mastery is not a permanent prize. It is an ongoing practice. Life will continue to test it. New relationships will come. New losses will come. New shadows will rise. But the man who has walked this path now understands the deeper truth. The greatest love story is not the one you build with another person. It is the one you build with yourself. If you want to uncover the hidden truths of the mind and master attachment on a deeper level than ever before, subscribe now and join us as we unravel the psychology men rarely speak about. Gain clarity, understand obsession, and reclaim your emotional freedom.